CRT is racist. It is abusive. It discriminates against one's color.
They are inserting an issue that does not even exist. It's not in our curriculum, and it's not in our lesson plans, and it shouldn't even be in our conversations.
I'm a white woman with children in Stafford schools. I want them to learn about our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
My children have to think that they're guilty of some crime that they haven't committed because of the color of their skin. I mean, I can't believe we're having this conversation.
This is a Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall. Crisis in the Classroom.
Childhood, an extraordinarily short time in our lives, is unquestionably the most significant. Every lesson our children learn prepares them for the rest of their life. It shapes them into decent, honest, and productive citizens. And it allows them to not only contribute, but also to improve our society and the lives of millions of others. As we talk about critical race theory during this town hall and across America, it has taken our attention away from the most important issue, which is making sure we prepare our kids for the future. While we should teach all of history, good and bad, a bigger problem is why are so many of our children, babies, functionally illiterate and can't do basic math and read basic English. That's what we should be concerned about. Parents are also worried about violence in schools. They say between fights, gun scares, and yes, lockdowns, they're afraid to send their kids to school. Alexis Marburger takes us into the crisis in the classroom.
We've received several tips about some school violence here at South High School. Those parents now tell us they're fearful to send their kids back into the classroom.
You know, this is crazy. I ain't never seen it this bad. And they just keep doing it.
Some Columbus City schools have had students and staff on lockdowns because of threats of violence.
He doesn't like to go to school whenever it's like that.
Paul Young has a 16-year-old student who goes to South High School and is becoming worried about some of the threats, violence, and gun scares happening in the school.
He gets scared, which I don't blame him. I wouldn't either. I'd be wanting to stay home too, but he don't want to stay home. He wants to go to school.
The school was put on lockdown Monday after Columbus police arrested a student at South High School. Police say the school's principal found a loaded gun in the 13-year-old's backpack after they showed it to another student. The student was then charged with having a deadly weapon in a school zone.
Well, the last 2-3 weeks, they've had lockdowns at South High School.
According to Columbus City Schools, there have been 2 lockdowns since January. A spokesperson says a school can call a lockdown for threats of any kind, issues in the neighborhood, or surrounding investigations.
Not right for the kids.
But threats haven't just been made at South. Students and staff were put on lockdown Tuesday at West High School after a teacher was approached by 2 people and demanded she get out of her car. When she didn't, they fired their gun in the air and into the car, shattering her window.
And yet the schools won't hire a police resource officer to take care of it and do what they're supposed to.
Young says he wishes the school could add school resource officers, but the district says they have 104 safety and security personnel, but wouldn't tell us how many work at each school. For Crisis in the Classroom, Alexis Moberger reporting.
We have our guests to talk to us more in depth about these issues and our children. Kathy Pulse is president of the Upper Arlington Education Coalition, and Kevin Magruder is the associate professor of history at Antioch College. And we welcome you both into this discussion. You know, Professor Magruder, why is it that the mere mention of race creates such a framework of black versus white? They become like polarizing magnets and everybody takes sides. Why?
I think our country has a hard time acknowledging that we were founded by separation based on race, that slavery was the foundation of the economy. In the early days of our country, our Constitution protected that element of the economy. And justification for slavery was based on race. And once slavery was over, all of those ideas about black inferiority did not disappear. And segregation, Jim Crow, all of those things that the civil rights movement tried to overturn, still, those things have not really been addressed. And so there are some people who think all of that's in the past and we should just forget about it. But as Abraham Lincoln said, you can't escape history. And that's something that our country has a really hard time confronting.
You know, Kathy, some would say using critical race theory to explain social inequality, especially when most people are experiencing inequality, is a non-starter.
I would agree that with critical race theory, I'm not sure why that is in the elementary schools, it's in the middle schools, it's in the high schools. It started out, they say that it's for law school, and I have an issue with teaching the children that the color of your skin impacts who you are from the moment you're born. That when you also are focusing on equity instead of the word equality, and certainly our country did have slavery, we did have Jim Crow laws, and our children are being taught that in schools. But my question would be, what is the outcome we're expecting from second graders learning about critical race theory? Why do they need to know that? Where are we going with that? Why is one group of people an oppressor and the other group is oppressed? And from what I've heard about critical race theory, those are your only two options. You are either, if you're white, you're racist, and if you're a black child, then you must be oppressed.
You know, Professor Magruder, you take a very hard line on COVID protocols and the mask. Obviously, and this could be because of the midterm elections, people are moving away from the mask mandates and also in schools. But your perspective is that we should not lessen the role of masks, we should increase it. Is that in the best interest of the child?
I've never said anything. I've never said anything about masks, so I'm not sure what the source of your information is. But I haven't written anything about that, and I haven't spoken publicly about it.
Well, you know, sometimes we make assumptions that are false. You get a chance to talk about it. Right. Your feelings about masks?
I think we should follow public health measures. And public health, what it is it incorporates science, but also the way human beings work and how they behave. And I'm 64, so I'm old enough to remember polio. And people were not resistant to taking the polio vaccine once it became available. And I believe that COVID has been politicized. We have 900,000 people dead in this country, and a lot of them shouldn't be. If we had listened to public health measures and that had not politicized it. And so I think, and those public health measures vary depending on where you are in the country, what the infection rates are. Like whether you need to wear a mask or not is not a blanket decision. It depends on where you are, and that's epidemiology. And so that's what I believe, but I haven't written anything about that or spoken about it publicly before now.
Thank you. Ms. Pulse, how do educators, how is it that they have to adjust their curriculum to not only embed critical race theory, but also anti-racism? And then what about the argument where some are saying that it's not even in the curriculum in the first place?
I'll address that part first, because most schools don't say, here's your critical race theory class, and we're going to have that second period. But many of the terminology, like say using the term white privilege, microaggression. Those things are used in the classroom, they're used by teachers. I think the biggest part with that is our schools just need to be transparent. You have the teacher union saying it's not being taught, but then they pass the national ones pass a resolution that it should be. So I think what parents are really looking for is honesty and transparency from their teachers, from the school boards, from the superintendents. And I think in the last few years, the positive thing about COVID is it's really pulled the curtain back from what's going on in our schools, and parents really need to start paying attention. And some of the school board meetings that were shown in the earlier clip, it's parents want to know what's going on, and they don't appreciate some of the things that have been done behind their backs.
Professor Kevin Magruder teaches history at Antioch College, and Kathy Pulse is president of the Upper Arlington Education Coalition. We're going to continue this discussion, not just about critical race theory, but also about masks and their mandates and other issues that involve our children and the larger society. Goodbye. Let's turn our attention now to the parents and let them have their say in this debate about education and about masks. We're joined by Andrea Gross and Amy Gonzalez. We welcome them both to the program. So what do you think their ultimate goal is? Because I think everybody will agree that the priority should be that the children learn, that they're educated, so they become productive citizens to society. So what do you think is their ultimate goal or the arterial goal?
I think the ultimate goal is right now is to silence parents because they do not want a collaboration between the parents and the schools. And, we, as you know, Martin Luther King didn't give his speech in a basement. And that's because if you're really proud of what you're doing and you really believe in, its truth and the value, then you would be fine to shout it out at the rooftops to anybody that wants to listen to it. But we're finding that this all involves a lot of just behind the scenes, a lot of things that are not transparent, like in our case, for example, unlike schools in the public situation, which again, that's another divisive thing. We find that everything is about trying to find division between races, between genders, between public and private. And we have found through this journey that teen parent is really what we all are, whether you're in public or you're in private. We all really want the same things. We want our kids to be safe. And again, like you said, educated. But what we don't want is the normalization and the desensitization and sexualization, for example, of our kids, which we
And I think ultimately what we ask is, what are you teaching our children? And what will they have learned when they leave here? And when you cannot get a forthright and candid answer from, if you're in public, your superintendent or your board of trustees, in our case, that just points, the alarm bells go off for sure.
I think then we need to go a little deeper here, because to me, I don't even want to sit here and have a debate of whether parents should be involved in their child's education. To anyone with a modicum of common sense, it's obvious you should be involved not only in their education, but all aspects of of their lives. Those are your children. You care about them more and understand them better than anybody else. So we're not going to have that debate. But why would unions and other special interest groups set up dynamics to over-sexualize the kids, to teach what they consider to be critical race theory? You know what your kid is being taught in the curriculum. You know what other parents are saying. So it's not as if we're talking out of both sides of our mouth. This is what everybody's saying. So what is their true agenda? What do they want?
I think they want ultimately to control the narrative. And this has been a long game.
And to make a lot of money off of it.
And they make a lot of money off of it. I mean, like in the private school situation, there is literally an entire complex of consulting firms that make tens of millions of dollars every year off of this indoctrinating agenda.
And they target with surveys even here in Central Ohio, our public schools. The surveys are being filled out, sometimes for the littlest of children, by the teachers. And then this information gets sold. The data collection ends up following your child through their entire education and could possibly end up in government databases. So a lot of people are making money off of these surveys. In our case, they did a gender survey where they enticed the children with gift cards that were supposedly anonymous. You could take the survey anonymously, but you would be able to find out if you want a gift card, pizza, ice cream. And the survey results went to the University of Pennsylvania and were ultimately up for sale.
Well, I want to tell you this, okay? And even though I'm moderating this crisis in education, no parent is going to sit around and allow anyone to cripple or marginalize their child. And while they may have felt that you've been sleeping at the wheel, is one thing that COVID did do, it brought about an awakening where you could not ignore the facts and what is obvious. And they've awakened a sleeping giant. And why don't you tell the rest of the country, now that a sleeping giant is awakened, what you will not tolerate anymore and what you demand going forward?
Well, I just think as teen parent, we do have a right to know what our children are being taught, and there is accountability for that. In our case, we ended up last week filing a lawsuit to protect the interests of our children, and it's all children. It goes beyond our 3 kids and our school. It's every child. If we move the ball forward for transparency and accountability, all children will benefit.
And I think what's most important here, though, is that you've seen progress when you've decided to step in and lead the superintendent, the school board, anyone else. Because what you realize that if the people are not awakened and don't lead, you'd have the same results and the same dismal what you're seeing in these schools in terms of what your child is becoming. Because sometimes children go home and their parents don't even recognize them anymore.
Absolutely. That's often the case. It is. And that's why it's just so important that if you see something or you hear something that is untrue, it is a moral responsibility to speak up.
As a parent, we hear all the time, because we do have the private school situation in our particular circumstance. Well, then take your kids out of public schools and send them to private. And we keep on saying, no, in many circumstances, the private school situation is even worse. The kids have no freedom of speech. A lot of these contracts are being rewritten now where it goes beyond just the children or the parents. It could be anybody. In our case, they quelled our freedom of speech, not just our kids, and expelled our children. And they did nothing wrong. Our children.
The last question, and we are so grateful to have you both join us for this very critical conversation. How are your children?
They're resilient, because children are, and our children are. They are resilient kids, and I feel like they have been through a lot. We have all been through a lot. This has been not just trying to, this has been very difficult. I mean,
predatory alienation.
Yeah, they have tried to absolutely destroy our lives and make us out to be, as you can imagine, called us every name in the book. And yet here we are, and our shoulders are back, and we're still standing. And we are trying to show our children and all parents out there that
courage is contagious.
Yes,
courage is contagious.
But I think the message that you both are telling the world is that we are parents, and we love our children, and we're going to make sure that we get what's best for our children in this school system.
They're the most vulnerable, absolutely.
But if you want to know any more about our case in particular, or about private schools and the NAIS, there are a lot of parents across the country putting this information together. So you can go to Undercover Mother and figure out the NAIS. You can read a lot more about that. And if you want to help our particular situation, please go to Give, Send, Go and look up Columbus Academy, and you can learn more about what our case is about in Columbus.
Well, let me say this to you as the moderator. No one can ever walk in your shoes, because you just can't come on in a segment and everybody know the battle that you fought and what you continue to fight and what you endure and the price that you pay for it. let me just thank you all for being courageous, willing to take a stand, and willing to sacrifice it all to have it all for all future kids. And thank you so much for joining us, and God continue to bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you for this
Thank
opportunity.
you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And we'll be back. Don't go away. Critical race theory was a driving force in the November elections. As David Winter reports, school boards were a major target for parents.
There's a virus among us.
Only one of the Forest Hills School Board members who sat and listened to this concerned parent earlier this year is still on the board. The rest have been replaced.
I'm not talking about COVID-19. Virus I'm talking about is critical race theory.
The voters spoke on November the 2nd.
Sarah Jonas, a Forest Hills mom, is one of those new Forest Hills School Board members. She says she decided to run in part because of a poetry assignment her daughter brought home.
It was basically a social justice video, and that's the perfect example of the critical race theory language and framework entering the classroom.
You would think social justice would be taught in social studies classes.
Sure, so history should be taught, the good, the bad, the ugly. I totally agree with that. But when it comes to teaching our kids that there is, you're oppressed or you're an oppressor, or you have implicit bias, microaggressions, all of that, those are components of critical race theory, which I don't want my children to be a part of.
And the voters agreed, also electing Katie Stewart, Bob Bibb, and Linda Marie Hausfeld. While Jonas was the only one of the four who spoke to us for this story, this is the remaining school board member whose seat was not up for grabs.
They hijacked school board elections across the country, and Forest Hills was no different.
Leslie Rasmussen says those four and beyond were primarily elected because they spread misinformation about CRT.
They have taken terms like diversity, equity, inclusion, and said that must be critical race theory. Well, we know that's not true.
But true or not, many voters believed their children were being taught that white people are oppressors, people of color are oppressed, and American institutions like the courts are biased against people of color.
There is nothing where teachers are saying, okay, you're white, so you are oppressing your fellow classmate who happens to be Black or Latino or Asian. That is not happening.
Those who are anti-critical race theory say CRT is absolutely being taught in these schools, and they have proof. Dan Reganold leads the coalition StopCriticalRaceTheory.com. He has compiled a book he says contains dozens of examples of CRT.
On their digital sign, they say, all lives can't matter until Black lives do. Now, is that what we want to be teaching children in our schools?
The voters said no in Forest Hills and hundreds of other districts across the country. In Cincinnati, I'm David Winter reporting.
We welcome Brian Steele to the town hall. Brian ran unsuccessfully for Worthington School Board. And Brian, why did you run?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I'm a parent. I didn't like some of the decisions that were being made by my board, some of the decision-making process and a lack of transparency. So instead of complaining about it, I thought I would try to do something about it.
Where in a child's education should parents play a larger role?
Yeah, so I think from day one, I've been involved in my kids. They're socially, academically, and sports, since kindergarten. And I have 5 children. And, she asked me personally from day one.
Obviously, Brian, the pandemic has changed so much, especially in K through 12 public schools they have worries and concerns. What concerns you about what has changed and what has changed so drastically?
Yeah, so first and foremost, education is my number one as a parent, as a taxpayer, my children's education, what they're being taught, how they're being taught, and also the finances. If as a taxpayer, if we're going to be heavily taxed and get low bang for our buck, we're obviously going to have a lot of questions. If our children aren't passing state tests at the rate they should, we're going to have a lot of questions.
There's so much in the news today about critical race theory. How do you respond to the parents who say that CRT separates children of different backgrounds and races?
Yeah, so I would say that CRT and American history are two completely different things, and somehow, possibly for political reasons, depending on what side you're on, they were blended together. I think they're two completely different talking things.
Oh, well, talk about how they differentiate.
Yeah, so I could tell you, and the campaign I spoke about this, the parent I spoke about this. I think American history needs to be taught. It needs to be taught at age-appropriate levels. We have a dark stain on our history, such as slavery. We don't hide from it. We need to address it and let the children know. CRT, however, is this kind of blanket umbrella that everything's racist. It's a theory, it's an opinion, it's a belief. I believe history is taught on facts, not if my child is doing bad in math, it's because of racism. Cops in schools, racist. A child can't pay for his lunch, racist. That's where I have a different of opinion.
And that's why we invited you on to join us today. We thank you for being a part of this important conversation.
Thank you so much.
Professor Magruder, you've been listening patiently to this conversation. Any observations?
Yes, it's disappointing that as a country, we've allowed ourselves to be bamboozled. There is ample evidence to show that this, quote, critical race theory controversy is a manufactured controversy. Christopher Rufo, a journalist working with the Manhattan Institute and other publications, began promoting the idea that almost everything he didn't like was critical race theory. Critical race theory is a particular thing that was developed in the 70s and 80s by law school scholars. I teach history at the college level. I do not teach critical race theory in my classes. Nobody is teaching that in K through 12 classes. What some of the people who were on these packages that we just viewed are talking about are things they don't like, but they're claiming that they're critical race theory when they are not. There is no value to demeaning children in a classroom, and that is not what critical race theory does. What it does is look at the ways that our legal system incorporates the racism that is part of our history. And that is not something that third graders are being taught.
Ms. Paultz, you're an educator. What are the best ways to discuss our country's past while also teaching our children that they are dreams of our future?
Well, I think that's where I was talking before, where the word equality comes in. I mean, you do, again, age appropriate, talk about the history and how we did have slavery and why, you know, when they signed the Declaration of Independence and said equality, but we had slavery, but that was to get the southern states to agree to create a new country, and then we did have the Civil War. So I think losing my train of thought. I think that when we say there's no CRT in the schools, I don't think that is the case. I think I know of stories where children came home and said, you know, Mom, there's nothing I can do. I'm always going to be white. And that was in one of our local school districts. So, and maybe it's just some teachers who aren't supposed to be doing something, but I think we also use the word equity. When I talk, there's a difference between equity and equality. And I think our schools are focusing more on equity, where everybody has the same outcome, as opposed to equality, where we have the opportunities and what do you do with that opportunity. And certainly there is racism, and there are certainly people who don't have some of the same opportunities, but I think our country continues to work on that, and we need to teach our children, you know, you can be the best that you can be. And you know, that's where I would say, that's what I would say.
So Professor Magruder, you think it's a grave disservice when you paint this argument that you're saying that whites are still oppressors, they're racist, and they don't want Black history taught in the classroom? You're saying that's what, it's not about that.
No, it isn't. anyone who's taught will understand that it's a cooperative activity. If you demean children, you lose them. And so making a white child feel bad about themselves or a black child feel bad about themselves, you're not going to be doing effective teaching. We can all think about how we would feel when we were students if we had a teacher doing that. And the claim that teachers are doing that by people who are saying this is critical race theory is not accurate. Teachers do not, I can't say nobody does that, but if they do, it is very rare. That is not something that people are teaching. The reason why this is a manufactured controversy is because it allows people to mobilize their base. We have a governor of Virginia who rode to victory on that. This package you showed about school boards, people are mobilized around it. You can mobilize about things that are not true, and that's what's happening. And we are going to pay for this in the future because it's dividing us and keeping us from doing the real hard work that we should be doing, which is understanding the truth and figuring out how we together move forward to create a society of liberty and equality.
Kathy, you believe these parents mobilizing all across the country empower parents in their child's education. We're running out of time here. I'd like for you to speak to that and also briefly speak to, should our children have to wear masks all day in school, or at least any part of school day?
Well, I think the mobilization, I don't think it's manufactured, because I do feel that things are happening in the classroom, and maybe if it's the total definition of critical race, that's not there. But parents came because things were happening to their children. And I think the masks, I definitely believe parents should have the opportunity to choose whether their child is masked, and I do think, unfortunately, that became political. Schools are just now in Ohio voting that masks should be optional, and I've always felt a parent should decide that, especially as we're later. Obviously, the first spring of the pandemic, when schools were closed and we didn't know anything about it, and it was the best thing. And we are into the second full school year, and putting masks on kids where you have some places where they don't. And I think our Ohio governor did not take advantage of his authority, who should have just said they should be optional everywhere, instead of giving each local school board and health department the decision on what to do. Parents need to be in charge of their kids' health.
When we come back, we'll talk more about this critical race theory. Dr. Jason Nichols is an award-winning full-time senior lecturer in the African American Studies Department at the University of Maryland, College Park, and he joins us. You know, Dr. Nichols, critical race theory is portrayed as something that a number of white people don't want in this country. Is that fair, and does that really summarize what the issue really is?
Well, thank you for having me, Armstrong. I think that there's a misunderstanding on what critical race theory is and whether it's being implemented in schools. And that is caused a lot of anxiety with a lot of families who believe that what their children are being taught is to dislike themselves or to see themselves as oppressors. And number one, that's not what critical race theory does. And number two, I don't believe that critical race theory is being implemented in the school systems throughout the country. I think that we need to understand what critical race theory is. It is an intellectual framework. And within that intellectual framework, there are many different opinions, but the primary issue is that race is socially constructed, meaning that it has to do with human relations and relationships of power between power and race. It started out as a legal theory with people like Derek Bell and later on Kimberly Crenshaw and many others, Richard Delgado and many other names who have contributed to what critical race theory is. but it's not being taught to your children. What your children are learning is essentially, in many cases, is to be a better citizen. And there are people who have seized this as a political opportunity in order to rile people up and get them to the polls and get them voting. And it's been very successful. We saw what happened in Virginia, but it's really not the concern that people think it is because it's been bastardized by people who have a political agenda.
You know, I find that fascinating. So you don't think that most Black people even care about this and that they're just as concerned about education equality and not these wedge issues?
Right. Well, I think that African American people understand that education, you and I would agree, we've talked about many elements of education before, that education is an issue for African American people. They want the best education for their children. They also want their children and their neighbors to be good citizens. And so teaching them about power relations, teaching them about what our nation has been through, and teaching them about what their responsibility is moving forward to be good citizens, regardless of race or gender identity or sexuality, I think is really important. And that is part of the education. There is some pushback on that. And I think that that's unfortunate. I think most African Americans and other people want their children to learn to be good citizens, learn the true history of the United States, and learn their responsibility to be better in the future.
You know, it's always good to have you on and hear your well thought out perspective. Dr. Nichols, again, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Anytime, Armstrong. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. You know, I'm going to put our panelists on the spot. I'm going to do something different. Kathy, I'm going to have you ask a question to Professor Magruder.
I would ask, so what is systemic racism? Is that part of CRT?
As it applies to the legal profession.
Okay.
That's what the originators of critical race theory were looking at. In the late 70s, they were looking at the civil rights legislation of the 60s, which we thought was going to revolutionize things. And they were asking the question, why didn't it? What are the barriers? And they began to look at the law and at the way the law incorporates systemic racism within it. We just have to look at who's on death row now to see the evidence of that. There are very few white people on death row, although there are a lot of white people who do things that should put them on there. If we look at why the Black and Latino people are there, and when you look at why that is, what they looked at is the way that our legal system incorporates that, the way our policing polices Black and Latino people different than white people. You look at marijuana, and studies show that across races there's equal use, but when you look at who gets arrested for it, it's Black and Latino people. And so they get policed that way, they get charged that way, and so that's an example of systemic racism within the legal system. And so the law is not neutral, and that's what they're getting at.
So Professor Magruder, in the name of fairness, I'm going to ask you to ask a question to Kathy.
I know you've been very involved with the Upper Arlington school system, and my question would be, what things were you hearing from parents that led you to believe that critical race theory was being taught to their children?
Within our school system, even just letters that came home, the emails that came home that, like I said, use the microaggression terms, that we need to think about our privilege, some of our DEI things. But then I'm also involved with another group called Protect Ohio Children, and they gather information from around the state. And I know that, you know, like one of the stories I told earlier was from one of those families. So once you get involved in something like that and you create, like the Upper Arlington Education Coalition, I get emails from other people saying, you know, you're getting information from your school board. Where do I go to find this information for ours? How do I address our school board or our principals or our superintendent? So a lot of people are out there just asking questions, and again, worried about their kids, and in terms of our schools don't seem to be focusing on academics as much. What I love about what we're doing is we're having a discussion. And unfortunately, in our society, it's hard to have the discussion without being called names, or you have, you know, somebody's complaining about you, and you can't have a discussion or a debate. And I think we're about the same age, and we grew up and went to college where you just debated and talked about anything and didn't attack the other person for their beliefs or what they thought. You tried to change their mind, or and unfortunately, our kids today don't get that. I have a daughter at Ohio State who never gets that. She can't really have great discussions, because if you don't toe the line, you know, they don't want to hear from you.
No, I think you. Could I just say
please,
one thing?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
That the terms you mentioned, microaggressions, diversity, equity, and inclusion, those are all terms that were originated in an attempt to reach equality. So microaggressions are things that people might think are unimportant, that are really insulting, and are often directed by people in power to people who have less power. And in this classroom, whether we like it or not, white children have more power than children of color often. Studies have shown that teachers often look at children of color different in the classroom, police them in different ways. And so a microaggression is something directed at those children, talking about their hair, talking about their skin color. And the child doing that is not necessarily mean, doing it out of malice, but does it because they don't understand how hurtful that is.
You know, I'm gonna say it would be a really sad commentary if people are judged today by what they look like instead of the meritocracy in the classroom. I think we've come much further than that. And coming up next, we'll be talking to the former Ohio Secretary of State. Remote learning has been a struggle for some students. Parents are concerned more than ever that their children are falling behind.
It's a struggle. Distance learning wasn't easy for Stephanie Lamont's two daughters, especially 9-year-old Brenna.
She showed signs of depression. She was crying. I never saw behaviors like that from her before. She couldn't stay focused, sitting on a computer, had no connection. She missed her friends. It was heartbreaking for me.
Now, with both Brenna and her younger sister, 5-year-old Madison, back to in-person learning, Stephanie worries about the academic fallout. She says online classes simply didn't work for her kids.
She's just trying to get through it. She doesn't really care what the questions are. She doesn't absorb the information.
And Stephanie's family is far from alone. A recent survey of Rhode Island parents from the Hassenfeld Institute at Bryant University found nearly 70% are worried their children fell behind during the pandemic.
If we don't address it as the adults in the room, it's not going to get addressed and it's not going to get fixed.
State Rep Julie Casimiro of North Kingstown says that's why she's introduced legislation to measure pandemic learning loss in every school district across the state, and then make plans to fix it.
I think we're going to see a huge difference between the suburbs and the urban core.
Casimiro says she realized how serious the problem was when a young employee in a local store couldn't make change from a $20 bill for a purchase that cost $18.50.
They're in the workforce and they can't give you accurate change. That's a problem.
The bill was heard in the House Education Committee last week, and Casimiro is pushing to get it passed this session. I'm my team reporter Katie Davis, NBC 10 News.
We welcome the former Ohio Secretary of State, Kenneth Blackwell, to the show. Hello, my friend. How are you? Thank you so much for joining us. What if we learn from mask wearing? What should we take away and what should we discard?
Armstrong, it's so good to be with you. What we've learned is that if we follow the science, these masks have very little impact on the ability to stop from contracting COVID. And so to mandate something that is ineffective not only infringes upon our individual liberty, it is in fact an assault on common sense under the false labeling of following science. And so what we know is that what's at risk in the continuation of this government enforced mandate is a loss of liberty, but it's very consistent with the other strains on individual liberty by this administration, which is just riddled with status, some Marxists, some big government welfare state enthusiasts, but all are enemies of individual liberty.
What are your biggest concerns in education right now, Mr. Blackwell?
Well, my concern is that there's a real difference between indoctrination and education, teaching kids to be independent, critical thinkers, as opposed to humanoids that follow the dictates of some authoritarian force, whether that be a government-controlled curriculum where kids are not encouraged to be thinkers, but to be docile followers. That's a real problem. I have a real concern when you try to separate parents from the education of their children. As we've said before, the family is the incubator of liberty. You know, what Mao Zedong did between 1966 and 1976 was to turn children against parents. And as a consequence, what they tried to do is to replace parents with the state. And that's a real concern that I have in public education today. If we don't allow for choice and parent involvement and control, what we do is surrender the responsibility and the rights to bring up our kids and the next generation to the state. And that is as anti-American as you can be.
Former Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Ohio and Ambassador, it is our honor having you today, and thank you for your service, not only to your state, but to our country.
Good to be with you. God bless you, Armstrong.
Same to you. Whatever the debate is about how we should educate our children, we must never lose sight of the fact that their level of education will dictate their success and their contributions to America and the world. If we forget this, then our children might be stripped of their humanity, becoming simple chess pieces for our politicians to maneuver around a grave future that we must avoid at all costs. Parents, come on, should have a right in dictating what their children learn. It's important. It's also important that we think of the future, where other countries are outpacing the United States in English, math, science. Listen, we just can't afford to be distracted, because that's exactly what our adversaries want. We need to be united with our focus on the future of America and our children, and not on ideas that cause more division. Thank you so much for joining us for Crisis in the Classroom. I'm Armstrong Williams.